Now we'll turn our attention to the book of Zechariah, which is the second of the post-exilic prophets. I've called this one Reinforcing the Spiritual Renewal. Since Haggai delivers the opening sermons to the exiles to try to move them and inspire them and to get them rolling again on the project of the temple, Zechariah now is going to come in as the colleague of Haggai, and his preaching will continue to support and encourage the people in this new direction. If we look at Haggai's dated sermons, and there are 4 of his sermons, and they're all dated, we can fit the ministry of Zechariah into this. So as you'll notice, Haggai's first sermon is at the end of August, his second is near the end of October, but then at the very end of October, you have Zechariah's first sermon on October the 27th. 520 BC. Then in December, there are the 2 sermons that Haggai does in the winter. And then a couple of months or so after that, Zechariah is going to give his next sermon, which is found in Zechariah 1 in verse 7, which occurs on February the 15th in the early part of the next year. And then he will eventually give yet another sermon that's dated in chapter 7 in verse 1, which will occur on December the 7th, 518. So you can coordinate the dates between Haggai and Zechariah and see that they are working together as they are reinforcing the renewal, they are encouraging people, they're trying to make sure that no momentum is lost. About Zechariah, the man, the prophet, a couple of things we can say. First of all, of course, he is the colleague of Haggai, but his genealogy is given in Ezra 5:1 and Ezra 6:14, and he is called the son of Iddo. However, when you read the book of Zechariah itself, particularly the first verse and the 7th verse, you discover that the term son of Iddo should be taken in the sense of descendant or grandson of Iddo. This is fairly typical Hebrew language. The term son of in Hebrew, or ben, the Hebrew word ben, can mean direct father of, but it can also mean ancestor or descendant of in a longer sense, and probably that's the way we should take it here. His name Zechariah means Yahweh has remembered, and it's quite interesting that this particular name is found a number of times in the Old Testament. In fact, there are no less than 31 people in the Hebrew Bible that have the name Zechariah. So it's a very familiar name. We think that Zechariah was probably the younger colleague of Haggai for a couple of reasons. First of all, Haggai is the one who seems to take the initiative at the beginning. But secondly, in chapter 2 and verse 4 of Zechariah, Zechariah is called a Na'ar, which is the Hebrew word for young man. This term, usually in the Hebrew scriptures, refers to a young man, usually single and usually of marriageable age. So that is not quite the same as saying we know exactly how old he was, but we can at least put him in the range of being a fairly young man. It may be that Zechariah, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, was a priest. If you look at the list of returnees with Zerubbabel back in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 4a and also verse 16, you will find that there is an Iddo listed in the priestly line. And if this is the Iddo that is the ancestor of Zechariah, then Zechariah also would be from a Levitical family and within the priestly line. And as we mentioned with respect to Haggai, it's not especially unusual for a priest to also be a prophet, as was the case for Ezekiel. When we look at the structure of the book of Zechariah, you'll see that it naturally falls into 2 large blocks. Chapters 1 through 8 are the dated sermons of Zechariah, and these are written in prose. Then when we get to chapter 9 through the end of the book, there are oracles that are undated, and these will be constructed in a combination of prose and quite a bit of poetry. Critical scholars often assume that these 2 sections are not written by the same person. Usually it is assumed that the first one is by Zechariah because he is named specifically. He's named in verse 1, verse 7 of chapter 1, then he's named in chapter 7 a couple of times. But within the last section of Zechariah, the chapters 9 through 14 section, there is no name for any of the voices that are there. And so many critical scholars assume that this last part of Zechariah has been written by someone else. In fact, in critical commentaries, you will often find that the book of Zechariah is divided into 2 volumes. There will be a volume for chapters 1 through 8. Then there will be a volume for chapters 9 through 13. And sometimes, as is the case with the book of Isaiah, you find people talking about 1st Zechariah, 2nd Zechariah. Even though those are not biblical terms, they reflect this critical opinion that Zechariah may have been written by more than one person. This idea is actually quite old. It goes back to the Jewish Talmud, where some rabbis suggested that the 2nd section was written by someone other than Zechariah and then was attached to the scroll that contained Zechariah in order to avoid losing it. So at least that idea is very old. And there is one other factor that is a puzzling one, and that is that in the New Testament, in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew attributes a passage to Jeremiah, but the actual passage is found in Zechariah 11, which is this last part of Zechariah. Whether or not Jeremiah may have written that, at least the fact that in Matthew's Gospel it does not term this as Zechariah, but someone else, leaves open the question as to whether the second part of the book of Zechariah was actually written by the same person or not. So this is a question that's kind of open. It's a question that we don't fully know the answer to, and you'll find scholars who are divided over that. As you look at those 2 sections, the dated oracles and the undated oracles, you'll notice that the first section has this opening paragraph with a reflection on the covenant. And then there is a rather lengthy section that goes all the way through chapter 6 that describes 8 night visions that Zechariah has. We won't talk about them at the moment, but we will be looking at them in detail, each one at a time. And then this first section of Zechariah climaxes with a vision regarding the crown on Joshua's head, a passage about fasting, and then a summary of all the promises that God has given to the returning group of the remnant. When we get to the undated oracles, we get into some very unusual kinds of literature. 2 oracles here, each of them about 3 chapters long, and both of them concerning war and victory and what appears to be a lot of eschatological, much farther into the future kinds of ideas. The first one describes the arrival of the great king in Jerusalem and the rejection of some bad shepherds. And the second one describes the representative of Yahweh who is pierced and the good shepherd who was struck down. So we'll be talking about those oracles a bit later, particularly as they are related to the coming of Jesus in the New Testament. So let's begin then with the opening reflection on the covenant in Zechariah chapter 1, the first 6 verses. Zechariah's preaching begins with a rehearsal of Yahweh's anger that resulted in the exile. The exile was not due to the weakness of God, it was due to God's faithfulness to His own covenant blessings and curses. And so, as it says here, Yahweh was very angry with your fathers. The exile of the people of Judah was therefore a judgment upon them. And even though Yahweh is described as being slow to anger, and that's repeated a number of times after the initial description of that in the book of Exodus, the exile had been inevitable if the nation did not turn back from their violation of the covenant. Yahweh was slow to anger. In fact, He allowed the nation to last for more than 4 centuries in which there was repeated violations of the covenant. However, at some point, if Yahweh is going to be faithful to His own covenant word, He will have to do what He said He would do if the nation did not turn from its covenant violation. And of course, what He said He would do is that after disciplining the nation in a variety of kinds of ways, including drought and invasion and pestilence, eventually, if the nation did not correct its course, if it did not turn back wholeheartedly to the covenant, then the final discipline upon the people would be the loss of the land. And that is described in Deuteronomy 28, and of course that is exactly what has happened in the exile. So now, as Zechariah addresses this group of Jews who have come back from Babylon to Jerusalem and are now in the process of rebuilding the temple, as he addresses them, he uses the ancient prophetic word shuv. This is a Hebrew word that means to turn or to return. And in fact, it is the word from which we get the New Testament word repentance in more of a Greek form, but it's still the basic same idea. So now Zechariah is going to say, you need to return from your evil ways and not live like your forefathers lived. Don't be like your forefathers, he said, to whom the former prophets cried out, thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, return from your evil ways. Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? But my words and my statutes, which I commanded my servants, did they not overtake your fathers? So they did repent and said, as Yahweh Sabaoth purposed to deal with us for our ways and deeds, so has he dealt with us. So now Zechariah encourages them, they must turn wholeheartedly to the Lord. And in turning to the Lord, he will fulfill to them the promises that he has made. So Zechariah's call for the remnant community is to turn or to return to the Lord and to fully, with their heart, repent toward him. Then we come to what I described earlier as the 8 night visions of Zechariah. These are things that the text says Zechariah saw in the night, and since these are visual, we call them night visions. Interestingly, they seem to be arranged in what scholars call a Keyistic structure. Now, a Keyistic structure is a structure that emphasizes the center of a text rather than the beginning or the end. For most of us that are familiar with either English literature or European literature, we are accustomed to seeing emphases being at the beginning of a text or at the end of the text. But the Hebrew literary form is a little different than that, in that often in Hebrew there is an emphasis in the middle of a text, and it is the center part of the text that is most pronounced. So in these 8 night visions, they can be arranged in a Keyistic structure so that the middle of the structure becomes the most important. So the first vision and the 8th vision are parallel with each other. 4 horsemen in the first vision, 4 chariots in the the 8th vision. Then the 2nd and 3rd visions and the 6th and 7th visions are parallel to each other. And then finally, you have in the very middle the vision about Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor in chapters 3 and 4. This is the very center of the 8 night visions, and in this Keyistic structure, this is the emphatic part of the vision. So as we work our way through that, keep that in mind, that it is the center of the vision that is probably the very most important. So let's take a look at these 8 visions individually, starting with the first one, the vision of the 4 horsemen. The riders on these 4 horses presumably are depicting angelic beings of some kind, but they seem to be modeled after Persian dispatches, which were well known in the Persian Empire. The Persians created a royal road all the way from the center of Persia clear to the Anatolian coast, called the Royal Road. And along this royal road there were Persian dispatches on horseback that carried communications back and forth between the far-reaching parts of the empire and the very center of the government. These dispatches, Persian dispatches, then seem to be the metaphor that is being used here in chapter 1 to talk about the riders that are reporting to the angel of the Lord. In this case, of course, these aren't Persian dispatches, these are angelic dispatches that report to the Malach Yahweh, the term that refers to the angel of the Lord. And in their report, they report that political and military conflict has finally subsided. So, if you'll notice in verse 10, these are they whom Yahweh has sent to patrol the earth. And they said, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth remains at rest. Now, the idea of the earth remaining at rest, or the earth being in a state of peace, is really the result of Cyrus taking over the Babylonian Empire. When Cyrus invaded Babylon and Babylon fell, then after the fall of Babylon, there is a state of general peace in the whole Mesopotamian region. The wars have now ended, and so a state of peace, or a state in which war has subsided, is now going to be the prevailing atmosphere of the time. And so in this state of peace, it is in this state of peace that God then is going to instill within the heart of Cyrus that he should allow people to go back to their homelands and rebuild their temples. And of course, the Jews have taken advantage of that. Now, however, there is this passage in which it says that even though they are in a state of peace, which is very conducive for the Jews to make the trek back to Jerusalem, still there is anger at the nations because they have treated the Jews so badly, and there is great passion on the part of Yahweh in his eagerness for the rebuilding of his temple. In your text, most English text, it's going to use the word jealousy to refer to the emotions of God. That's an unusual thing, because in most of our English uses of the word jealousy, we tend to think that jealousy refers to something like envy or spite or something like that, and that probably is not the nuance we have here with respect to the term jealousy. Rather, I think you probably should think of jealousy in the sense of passion. Yahweh's passion has been deeply stirred. He's angry at the nations because they have mistreated his people, but he is passionately eager for the holy city and the temple to be rebuilt. Once, all the way back in the time of David, Yahweh had chosen Mount Zion as the place for his temple. And this is where, of course, Solomon built the first temple. Now, as you notice in chapter 1 and verse 17, he is going to choose it again. My cities shall again overflow with prosperity, and Yahweh will again comfort Zion and again choose Jerusalem. So this was a very encouraging message to the people. If God was passionate, about what was happening in Jerusalem, then how could the people be any less passionate than God? The basic theme of Zechariah's sermon then is you should be passionate about what God is passionate about. And if God is passionate about this, if he is so aroused about this rebuilding of the temple, then surely the remnant must be passionate as well. How could they be anything less than passionate about what God has decided to do? Here's a little picture of a couple of sort of toy-sized horses and riders. These are fairly common finds in archaeological digs from the Persian period, and they depict Persians who are riding their horses, the dispatches we talked about that ride the royal road and report on various events in the empire back to the government. So the vision of the four horses is sort of patterned after these couriers. In the second vision, there is a vision of 4 horns and 4 craftsmen, or I'm going to use the word smith rather than craftsman. The word craftsman is fairly general, but since we're talking about horns, and we're talking about horns that are going to be dehorned, we're really talking about smiths. These would be very similar to a modern veterinary surgeon, I suppose, who would dehorn an animal. Bullhorns are very commonly a symbol of power in the ancient Near East. You find the term horn used in various poetic structures in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, in her Song of Rejoicing says, "May my horn be exalted." Well, that sounds really kind of odd, I suppose, to us in the Western world. But in the ancient Near East, the horn is a symbol of power. And you find it a number of times in the Psalms, in the book of Psalms as well. Here are 4 depictions of horns that I've shown you pictures of. There's one that is Canaanite. That one is even earlier than the time of Israel, because the bull was considered to be the strongest of the domestic animals. And a horned bull, of course, is a very heavy, a very powerful, very dangerous animal. The one in the lower left is Israelite, and it comes from the northern tribe of Manasseh. Was actually discovered by a Roman military officer. But again, you see the image of the bull with horns. Then the one in the upper right is from the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. This is the symbol of the bull Adad, which again is a symbol of the power of the gods of Babylon. And then the fourth one in the lower right is a Persian example. And in this particular case, you can see the size of this bronze casting because I'm standing right near it, and you can kind of get a proportionate look. This particular casting is in the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago in the United States, and you can see that the horns themselves have become detached from the bull's head, but you can see the projections where the bronze horns would have been attached in the ancient world. In any case, when Zechariah talks about 4 horns, he is talking about political powers. These are symbols of political powers. And when he talks about 4 smiths or 4 craftsmen who cut off the horns, he's talking about those governments or powers which would destroy the horns that had destroyed Israel. Now, there is more than one way to read the vision of these 4 horns. For one thing, the term 4 is often used as a schematic number in Hebrews rather than simply a mathematical number. For instance, when we talk about the 4 winds, this is a passage, a kind of reference you find in a few places in the Old Testament. But the 4 winds is basically a way of talking about all the wind from every direction. And so some would understand the 4 horns to simply be symbolic of those nations that, that conquered both Israel and Judah and took them into exile. In that sense, the primary oppressors would be Assyria, who took the northern nation into captivity, and the Babylonians, who took the southern nation into captivity. In this case, the number 4 just means all of the horns. So the northern nation of Israel, the southern nation of Judah are conquered by Assyria and Babylon, and then Babylon and Persia in turn conquer the Assyrians. So Babylon conquers Assyria, Persia conquers Babylon. And so in this case, the number 4 is taken in more of a symbolic sense. A second way of looking at this has to do with actual empires that persecuted the Jews. These could be understood as being more mathematical, with Assyria taking Israel into captivity, Egypt putting the southern nation of Judah to a vassal relationship and taking Jehoahaz into exile to Egypt, then Babylon, which took Jehoiakim as an exile to Babylon, and then finally Persia itself, which had a very serious effort to exterminate the Jews and the religion of the Jews. If you are familiar with the book of Esther, for instance, you'll remember that in the book of Esther there is a pogrom against the Jews, and there's a very concerted effort to destroy the Jews during the Persian Empire. These in turn were conquered by Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Babylon taking over Assyria, Persia taking over Babylon, eventually Greece under Alexander the Great taking over Persia, and finally you get all the way down near the period of the New Testament, and Rome will take over Palestine under Pompey in 63 BC. So this is a more direct interpretation of the 4 horns and the 4 smiths, using the 4 as an actual mathematical number. If we're only looking at Judah, and we're not taking into consideration the northern nation of Israel, then you could consider the oppressors to be Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. These then would be conquered. Babylon conquered by Persia, Persia conquered by Greece, Greece conquered by Rome, and then Rome conquered by the kingdom of God in the Christian era, when Rome eventually becomes Christian. And if you take this third view, it's very easy to parallel that with some of the visions in the book of Daniel, where Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome are described in the great image that Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel chapter 2, or by the 4 beasts that Daniel had a vision of in chapter 7. And these would be conquered by the Messianic kingdom and the coming of Christ. So there are some options for interpreting these 4 horns and these 4 smiths, but all of them describe, at least in one way or another, those who oppressed the Jews and those who were conquered after their oppression of the Jews. When we come to the third of the night visions, we have the vision of a man with a measuring rod or a measuring cord. This is what we would call a surveyor. A measuring cord may not immediately spell surveyor to you, but in this case, that's probably what he was, and you should probably compare it with the man in Ezekiel chapter 40, who is depicted as having a measuring rod by which he measures the city of Jerusalem. Presumably, here in chapter 2, the surveyor in Zechariah intends to survey the city so that the work of rebuilding can continue. There is some debate about the actual size of the city of Jerusalem at this point with the exiles in return. You can see in this little map I have that the striped area, the white and blue striped area, is a smaller area, and some scholars believe that this is the area to which Haggai and Zechariah would have preached, and which was now being rebuilt in the time of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Others, largely based on the text in Nehemiah that says the city was large, but the inhabitants few, suggest that in fact the city of Jerusalem may have been a lot bigger than that and goes all the way back to the size it was during the days of Hezekiah, particularly because of the mention of the broad wall. And so the solid blue area is the second option. This is a more maximalist view that describes the larger section of the city of Jerusalem. So we're not sure about that. Scholars debate that and still do not have final consensus on it. But nonetheless, the message is still basically the same. Jerusalem is going to become so heavily populated that it would have no walls. It would be almost like the ancient children of Israel coming out of Egypt. They would be protected by a wall of fire, just as they were in the Exodus, and God's glory would be in the city. So, if this was what was happening, if Jerusalem was going to be that populated and protected by God, then rebuilding the Second Temple was very much part of God's large, grand purpose for the future. So, we will continue with the fourth night vision when we come back.